Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ninth podcast. I'm Linda, and here is Mike.
Hi, Linda. Welcome, everyone. In this podcast series, we are exploring social threefolding by reading and discussing the original 1919 book by Rudolf Steiner called The Core Points of the Social Question. Now, the idea is that as humanity evolves toward a greater need for freedom, we are outgrowing our old, mostly hierarchical social structures. What we need today is a new social paradigm, a complete societal overhaul, something that goes beyond organizational innovation and working on ourselves individually. In fact, our whole social environment is dysfunctional, and we can't simply escape from it. In order to be healthy, we must take up the task of social healing with conscious social will. And as part of the process of awakening, we must awaken to what Steiner calls the true form of the social question. That is to say, we must move beyond the current dualistic paradigm of labor versus capital, of left versus right, to a new threefold paradigm. Only by bringing forth a threefold structuring of society can we find a way forward beyond the swings of the pendulum we currently find ourselves in. And then, with a new thinking that arises, we will be able to reconsider how we might solve societal problems we currently believe are impossible to solve. So, social threefolding presents a way forward, not backward. We need to dig down into the very roots of our current social dissatisfaction to discover the true remedy we need. This means rethinking how we think and why we think what we currently think. Because developing a new society involves developing, first of all, a new way of thinking. Okay, so that's what we're doing.
Thank you, Mike. And I have a viewer question. Let me read it. Is the goal to return to this more personable business style where the businessman comes face to face with customers? If so, how can our current society function with such a style when today we're living in a high demand world driven by consumerism and instant gratification? How could demand be met if we reduce the scale so things are more personable?
Okay, this is a great question. I want to just make it clear that the intention of social threefolding is not at all to reduce or downsize the economy to make it more personal. I would say the opposite, in fact. Steiner spoke about a greater development of the world economy and of greater global cooperation in the production of needed goods and services. So, social threefolding is not at all based on smallness or downsizing large scale industry, for example. It's not based on the ideas of scarcity or austerity or having less. Not at all. I would say Steiner's ideas are really to expand our consciousness so that we can think the whole process on a larger scale. I would say the main problem we face is really one of thinking. Historically speaking, we are now entering the stage of world economy, but our thinking has not yet made the leap to the kind of thinking that is necessary for a world economy. As a result, we're continually dealing with politicians and other policy architects who would push our economic relations backwards into what they find thinkable, rather than expanding our thinking forwards to achieve what is necessary for the present and future. Now, in 1922, Steiner gave a series of lectures called the National Economics Course that addresses this very question about how to think about economics in our times. And these lectures are well worth studying. On the other hand, Steiner proposed that economic associations should arise that bring about this broader economic thinking on local, regional, and ultimately interregional levels. So the basic idea of associations is to look beyond the limited horizon that any one individual experiences, and then after building up an exact imagination of the whole economic process, to bring rationality into the supply of goods and services such that enough is supplied in relation to demand. So as things are today, we generally leave things up to the invisible hand of the market, which of course is modified through various kind of government interference. And as things are today, we probably don't even realize how suboptimal this system is. In a threefold society, a great deal of wastage would be cut out, and things would be produced much more efficiently to meet our needs much more effectively than today. So, not a scaling down of our economy to match our thinking, which is limited, but rather a scaling up of our thinking and then achieve much greater production efficiency. I hope that answers the question.
That really is a great answer. I think it was an important sort of distinction where, understanding that it isn't about scarcity or less, and it's not sort of just because we're bringing community, like things to the community level, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, um, I guess we were talking about last time, um, the industrialization, people moving from the agrarian to the industrial and kind of losing themselves and losing their dignity. And so I guess the question was, are we going to sort of move into this sort of person to person connection type of thing? And then I guess the questioner may have imagined it being less. So that was really great. I think it's a good answer.
Yeah, Steiner was very much against self-sufficiency. He didn't believe in self-sufficient communities. Instead he thought that we should be serving each other and and not serving ourselves. This is
Hmm,
very important that in a local place you could produce on a large scale for others.
right. Okay. That's, it kind of expands the imagination a little bit more to have an understanding of this. It's such an interesting system and I'm very, let's just say, intrigued as to how this is going to unfold. And really, I mean, I'm seeing as we're going through the book right now, and we haven't we're on page 30. I'm already sort of feeling like my understanding of the world and how things have come about is already starting to shift. It's yeah. So I'm really appreciating this.
Excellent. Well, that's great. So let me just say a few words to review what we're talking about so far. And the last time especially, we had started to be engaged with the chapter one of the book. And in our last podcast, we started to build up a picture of the effects of capitalism and industrialism. So perhaps it's not easy to generalize, but we might imagine, first of all, how a great many people in Central Europe and other places had previously been involved in agricultural production. And this traces itself back to the long history of serfs and feudalism in the Middle Ages. But by the 19th century, a great many of these manual workers were beginning to be replaced by steam trains and steam tractors, machines that could do the labor of many men and horses, causing there to be less need for those merely working the land. And at the same time, the rise of the industrial age called workers to the urban industrial centers to work in factories on machines, producing a wide range of consumer goods and other products. So, in this process, people were torn out of their old social contexts, their agricultural contexts of family, community, religious faith, and spiritual connection with nature. And then they were placed into a new context, harnessed to machines for most of the day, producing goods for people they will never meet. People were now working for bosses, employers, even though in a certain sense they were really working for themselves, for money. And in any case, with this alienation and loss of community, the workers turned to their fellow workers for this community. And the working class was drawn to the ideas of Karl Marx in particular. He was instrumental in shaping a new worldview for the working class. This new worldview was based on science, at least on the scientific mentality, just at a time when science had become something purely materialistic. So the working class were guided by socialist agitators, people who instilled in them a view of the world and themselves that was purely material, a view that believed that the only thing worth striving for was material well-being. It was believed that if only the worker had a larger, more fair share of the wealth they produced, then the worker would be satisfied. But Steiner disagrees with this. There's something living much deeper in us, something that cannot just be fixed by outward measures. This deeper dissatisfaction ultimately comes from our loss of connection to what truly gives our life meaning and value, something we might call the spiritual, which was originally part of science, but then was stripped out of science over the course of recent centuries. So that's kind of what we were doing until now.
Yeah, thank you for the recap. That really brought things back. Mm.
Okay, so why don't we switch over to the book now?
Hmm.
Okay, so we had been reading last time there was this long paragraph, if you remember, that started on page 28, the defining ideas, and this paragraph
Hmm.
went down, it was really long, until it ended at the end of page 30. So I'm going to recap this paragraph very briefly because not gonna, it's a long paragraph, but um, we had chunked it into four chunks, if you remember. So
Hmm.
basically, this paragraph says that with the rise of technology and capitalism that accompanied the new industrial age, the working person could not find anything that filled their life with dignity and humanity. The working person felt alienated and had to rely only on themselves. They reached for what they perceived was something that could help them, modern science. They turned to modern science for their trust and faith, believing this shining sword would restore their dignity and humanity that they had lost. However, this occurred right at a time when the scientific view, which had originally evolved out of religious views, was being emptied of all spiritual content and was becoming something purely materialist. As a result, the proletarian lost access to spirit. Meanwhile, the ruling classes, who were generally not torn out of their social contexts, were able to hold on to their traditional worldviews. They certainly saw science as something interesting and valuable, but they had no need to seek out a new worldview overall. Science did not become an identity for the ruling classes like it did for the working class. So even though the working class person was not formally trained in science, they were taught by socialist agitators who were. These agitators who spoke to the men in beer halls after a long day's work convinced them they were merely natural beings who evolved from apes, and that material gain would make them happy. The workers took this entirely seriously and made it their identity. Thus, the same age of industrialism affected the two classes of people entirely differently. The ruling classes sought to integrate scientific advancements into their existing value system, while the working class, who experienced a loss of dignity and humanity, believed the only thing that could offer them any hope was the scientific way of thinking. All right, so that's my rough recap of the previous paragraph. Are you ready to go on, or
I'm ready.
do you want to say
Yes.
anything before we go on?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, so we're ready at the top of page 31, some readers,
Hmm.
and I'll just warm up what we're about to read. It's also not a short paragraph, but it's only three-quarters of a page.
Hmm.
Um, Now he's about to say something like how now to say that workers have a scientific mentality might elicit a skeptical reaction. We normally think of someone having a scientific mentality only if they have spent years in formal education. And the working person, of course, had no such education. But this is not what is meant here. What is meant is that the worker orients their whole life around science as a mentality, even though they may not have studied it as such. science becomes a vital belief system. On the other hand, the person who is well educated in the field of science may not actually orient their whole life around it. For such people, science remains a side issue while they orient their whole life around traditional values and ideas, even if they may claim to be progressive or non-religious. Okay, so could you
Mhm.
read that, please, this paragraph?
So I'm reading up to faith pulsate.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Some readers of these statements may feel an urge to smirk when reference is made to the scientific mentality of the proletarian way of thinking. A person may smirk who can only think of scientific mentality as what we acquire through many years of sitting in educational institutions, and who, when contrasts this scientific mentality with the content of the consciousness of the proletarian who has learnt nothing. The person smirks dismissively about fate determining facts of present life. But these facts attest to how many highly educated people live unscientifically, while the uneducated proletarian orients their life ethos towards science, which they likely do not even know. The educated person has taken up science. It is filed in a drawer with their soul. Yet this educated person stands within contexts of life and allows these contexts to orient their feelings, which are not guided by science. The proletarian is forced by their life circumstances to understand existence in a way that corresponds to the ethos of science. What the other classes call the scientific mentality may be alien to them, yet the conceptual direction of the scientific mentality orients their life. For the other classes, a religious, aesthetic, general intellectual foundation is decisive. For the proletarian, science, albeit often in its very last trickles of thought, becomes a living faith. Many a member of the leading classes feels enlightened, non-denominational. Certainly scientific conviction lives in their ideas, but in their feelings, the unnoticed remnants of a traditional living faith pulsate.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So I think the main idea here is that, as I said, the proletarians see science as a faith. Even though they don't quite understand it, they see it as a way forward for them. Whereas the ruling classes, they see it more as a kind of um, they integrate it into their worldview in a way, but it doesn't really affect their value system. They see science as a sort of technology, a means to an end, something more practical, but it doesn't really affect their value system. And so the ruling classes were not identifying themselves with science. They still kept their traditional values.
Mhm.
Yeah. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I'm still struggling to understand. I mean, I do get that, when you're taken out of the context of your family, of your traditional life, and then put into the machine life, that something fundamental is lost. And, you know, I guess I'm slowly seeing that, you know, how is it possible that someone loses themselves so fundamentally, becomes sort of full faith in science? I'm having a hard time sort of really seeing that, but I understand it intellectually. I can see how that can be a thing, and I also sort of see how where uh, the bourgeoisie or the capitalist, have not been plucked out of their life, can sort of see science as a tool, as something to be used, as something interesting, something that can move the world forward, um, but not having lost their connection to the divine or their soul. So, I'm sort of interested in seeing how this goes.
Yeah. No, you've said it very well that the ruling classes see science as an instrument,
Mhm.
but I want to just bring back this notion of the agitator. So for the working class, science was not merely a passive transition. It was actively brought to them by these agitators. So You can imagine that their life consisted mainly of getting up in the morning, working all day, and then listening to these agitators for hours while they're in the evening. So it was a big chunk of their life was taken up by these sort of preaching by the agitators who were teaching them the scientific mentality. So it didn't just happen passively, it was actively brought to them. And then through this, it passed into the population.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah.
Does that answer your question or your concern?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to sort of sit with it, but definitely, I mean, just imagining again, just really seeing, social media, today's form of, propagandists, um, and how it can have an effect on our psyche for sure. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
Marxism was really pushed onto people. It wasn't,
Hmm.
you have to think in the days before television and social media, people gathered into these groups to talk and socialize. And then these were the locations where these people got up on a stage and they talked and they
Hmm.
spoke to people. And so it was really pushed onto them, something like, so we would say social media today,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, it was really pushed,
Right.
right?
Right.
Didn't
Hmm.
this didn't happen just by accident.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Should we go on to the next paragraph?
Let's go on.
Now this paragraph straddles pages 31 and 32, and
Hmm.
it's not so long this time. And it goes, so what he's about to say is something like this, that when science emerged from the religious worldview, it did not retain any awareness that thinking is rooted in spirit. This disconnect between thinking and spirit was essentially ignored by the ruling classes, whose life continued to be filled with old traditions. However, the working class accepted the materialist way of thinking as an inheritance, and this way of thinking, in turn, led them to experience a degree of spiritual emptiness. Okay, if you could read
Okay.
that, please.
Sure. What the scientific way of thinking did not acquire from the old order of life was the consciousness that as a way of thinking, it is rooted in a spiritual world. This character of the modern scientific mentality could be ignored by members of the leading classes because their life was filled with old traditions. The proletarian could not do that because their new life situation drove the old traditions out of their soul. They accepted the scientific way of thinking as an inheritance from the ruling classes. This inheritance became the foundation for their consciousness of the human being. But this spiritual content in their soul knew nothing of its origin in a real spiritual life. What little the proletarian was able to take over from the ruling classes as a spiritual life denied its origin in the spirit.
So, in a nutshell, I think he's saying that our scientific way of thinking today has removed the idea of spirit from it. That we, and so that we think that scientific thinking has to be unspiritual or unrelated to the divine. We sort of associate science with atheism or something like that. And Steiner's saying that's not necessarily true. That is just how it currently is presented or how it's
Hmm.
come to evolve at the present time. But
Hmm.
this is not inherent to the idea of science.
Hmm.
So because of the specific way that science evolved in the 19th century, it got stripped of its spiritual character for a period, and that has led to this emptiness, feeling of emptiness, not so much because of lack of material needs. And this is really the driving element of the proletarian discontent.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting where, let me just go back to this. So the proletarian basically they accepted. the scientific way of thinking as an inheritance from the ruling classes. So that's interesting to me. Who are these agitators, and who are they brought from the ruling classes so that they can control the proletariat, or is that the?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say exactly that it was brought from the ruling classes. I would say that people like Marx and Engels, Engels himself came from a very wealthy family, in fact, and he provided support for Marx, who also wasn't that poor to begin with. But they were able to live a fairly bourgeois lifestyle and work on their theories about the proletariat and bring these
Hmm.
theories to the proletariat.
Hmm.
And so it wasn't exactly that the ruling classes were pushing something onto the
Hmm.
proletariat. I wouldn't say it like that. I would say that Marx and Engels really believed in what they were bringing,
Hmm.
their ideologies. Um, but at the same time, it was something that the working class inherited in the sense that it was something of the cultural life of the ruling class that they could connect to. So they couldn't
Hmm.
connect necessarily to the sculptures and the paintings and the music. That didn't seem to satisfy them. But the notion of science was somehow a way for them to maybe increase efficiency. It was really just a matter of getting a better share of the wealth that was being produced by the
Hmm.
industrial sector,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And so they saw this part of the inheritance of culture, the science, as being something that they could make use of. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So let's move on to the next paragraph. It's also not a long one. It is not unknown to me. So
Hmm.
basically, Steiner is saying here that many people, that's proletarians and non-proletarians alike, who
Hmm.
consider themselves to be practical, may consider this view about the impact of the scientific mentality to be out of touch. Such people would rather speak about outer events without regard to the underlying mentality that drives these events. As a result, the prevailing so-called practical thoughts have ceased to bear any relation to real world events. And based on these real events, we ought instead to have revised our whole way of thinking. Okay, so if you could read
Hmm.
that, please.
Sure. It is not unknown to me how these thoughts will affect non-proletarians and also proletarians who believe themselves to be practical and familiar with life, and who, based on this belief, consider what has been said here to be an out-of-touch view. The facts that speak out of the current world situation will increasingly demonstrate this belief to be a delusion. Anyone who can see these facts impartially must realize how a view of life that merely holds to the outer appearance of these facts ultimately only has access to ideas disconnected from the facts. Prevailing thoughts have been practical in adhering to facts until these thoughts ceased to bear any resemblance to these facts. In this regard, the current world catastrophe could be a schoolmaster for many. For what did they think would happen? And what did happen? Should it also be this way with our social thinking?
Okay, so he's speaking now about the war and
Mhm.
or all the events surrounding and what happened after the war. He's saying, practical people, this war should have been a kind of teacher, it should have taught us something. But because what do you think was supposed to happen? Like what do you think should happen? And should our social thinking not have to change?
Mhm.
So who's the practical and who's the out of touch one here?
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, it certainly begs the question, what got us here in the first place? And, how can we do this better
Right.
at the very least?
And it points just, he keeps pointing back to the same question. It's our thinking, it's our mentality that we need
Mhm.
to look at here.
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. Um, Now, in this paragraph, he's going to say, so it continues to the top of 33.
Yes.
Um, some proletarian advocates may object that Steiner wants to divert away from real life issues just in order to philosophize in a
Mm.
bourgeois way.
Hmm.
But such proletarian advocates utterly fail to realize how their own thinking itself originally evolved from the bourgeois worldview. So now even their own thinking remains bourgeois. What is necessary is not only to find a new outer life, but also a new inner way of thinking. The scientific way of thinking must be widened to include spirit so that it may inspire purpose and provide a life-bearing content for the modern person, much like the older conceptions once did. Okay, so if you could read that,
Hmm.
please.
Yes. Also, I hear in my mind the objection made by the advocate of the proletarian view of life out of the mood of their soul. Oh, here's another one who wants to divert the real core of the social question onto a track that seems easy for the bourgeois-minded person to take. This advocate does not see clearly how fate has given them their proletarian life, and how they try to move within this life using a way of thinking inherited from the ruling classes that overpowers them. They live proletarian, but they think bourgeois. Our new age not only makes it necessary to find a new life, but also new thoughts. The scientific way of thinking can only become a life-bearing content if it develops, in its own way, momentum for the formation of a fully human purpose in life, much like the one old conceptions of life developed in their own way.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Um, so did you want to make any comments about this or thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he's pointing to the proletarian. I mean, the fact that they are proletarian, like it just comes out of the, here's the ruling class. And, they've kind of been the ones that are the practical ones that have brought about the world as is. And now you're stepping into that world, and that very world, you're thinking like the bourgeoisie. And, you know, um, yet there's a little less of the meaning that spirit kind of brings, that the scientific way of thinking, devoid of spirit, um, I guess, is devoid of really touching in on the human purpose,
Mhm.
kind of like deepening into what is really deeply important. I don't know. I don't know if I'm wording that
Yeah,
correctly.
I think his main idea here is this last sentence. The
Mm.
scientific way of thinking can only become a life-bearing content if it develops in its own way momentum for the formation of a fully human purpose in life. Just like the old conceptions of life developed a kind of purpose in life in their way,
Mhm.
right? So he's saying that science needs to kind of move forward and not get stuck in this materialist trap, and it needs to rediscover its own inner spiritual being, as it were. And then once science can find its spiritual being, and the people that are attached to the scientific mentality will also be able to find a fulfillment, a kind of dignity and purpose in life
Mhm.
through science itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
And just as a sidebar, Steiner spent his whole life developing this new kind of science called spiritual
Mhm.
science.
Mm.
So he's not just saying someone should do this, he actually did it.
Mhm.
And now he's just referencing it in his book later.
Mhm.
Yeah. So he's not being a hypocrite here by any means. Okay? So let's move on. We have another longish paragraph.
Hmm.
This marks the pathway.
Hmm.
And in this paragraph, he's going to be saying that because the proletarian scientific mentality is based on thoughts devoid of spiritual content, it cannot provide life and purpose. And so now we can see the real need for a truly independent cultural life. People do not long for an unfree ideology based on materialism. They long, in fact, for a genuinely free thinking life, a free spiritual life. Understanding this is essential to grasping the core points of the social question. That is, the social demands arising from the proletarian soul. The demands of the working class must not be dismissed simply because such people seem uneducated. The fact
Hmm.
is that their social demands are directly linked to the ideological nature of their mentality. Okay, if you would read that, please.
Yep. This marks the pathway that leads to discovering, within the modern proletarian movement, the true form of one of the societal members. At the end of this pathway, the conviction resounds from the proletarian soul: I strive for spiritual life. But this spiritual life is ideology, is only what is reflected in the human being from external world processes, and does not flow from any particular spiritual world. What became of the old cultural life in the transition to the new age is felt by the proletarian view of life as ideology. Anyone who wants to understand the mood within the proletarian soul that plays itself out in the social demands of the present must be able to grasp the implications of the view that spiritual life is but ideology. Someone may reply, what does the average proletarian know about this view, which haunts the befuddled heads of more or less educated leaders? Anyone who talks like this skirts around life in speaking, and in taking action also skirts around real life. Such a person does not know what has been going on in proletarian life over recent decades. They do not know the threads that spin from the view that spiritual life is but ideology to the demands and actions of the radical socialist they consider merely ignorant, and also to the actions of those who make a revolution out of dull life impulses.
Okay, thank you, Linda.
Mm.
So, yeah, here Steiner's kind of making a link between the demands of the proletarian, the social demands, and ideology. So he's saying the word ideology, he brings it up in this paragraph to be something really important to think about. That in a way, an ideology is a kind of empty philosophy. It's more like a kind of something you memorize rather than something you really experience, we'll say. And so these working class people are going around with a kind of memorized ideology, a kind of hollowed out set of concepts that they do identify with for sure, but they're not fully understanding, we'll say, and it's not living in them in the same way as something more depthful. So it's something more like an intellectual understanding of the world
Mhm. Mhm.
that is forming their worldview.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Yeah. Thank you for saying it because I was kind of getting lost in that
Yeah,
in the words.
Steiner is really difficult to understand. It takes a lot of time to really permeate what he's saying. So that's why I'm
Mhm.
hoping that my little warm-ups help clarify
Mhm.
what he's saying. Okay,
Yeah.
let's go on. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this
Mhm.
part of the book because it's a little repetitious, but we'll
Mhm.
just zip through it. Okay, so the
Yeah.
next paragraph carries on. It's a fairly long paragraph.
Mhm.
Herein lies the tragedy, and in this
Mhm.
paragraph, he's going to say that the current tragedy results from an inability to see what, within the masses, is pressing to the surface. On the surface, the proletarian believes that once the means of production become socially owned, once the exploitative ruling classes are gone, then workers with equal rights will gain the human dignity they currently lack. However, the much deeper issue remains the loss of supportive soul content in the industrial age. The desire to end the ruling class's exploitation of the workers is not the true form of the social question. For if the working class had inherited a genuinely spiritual, soul supporting worldview, then they would raise their social demands in a completely different way. As things are, their worldview remains merely an ideology, and that is ultimately what makes them unhappy. It is the ideological character of contemporary cultural life that is the primary root cause of social dissatisfaction. Okay,
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
so if you could read that, please.
Mhm. Herein lies the tragedy that shrouds the recognition of social demands of the present, that in many circles there is no feeling for what is pressing its way to the surface of life from the soul mood of the broad masses, that we are unable to direct our gaze to what is really going on in people's minds. The non-proletarian listens fearfully to the proletarian's demands and hears. Only by socializing the means of production can a dignified, humane existence be achieved for me. But the non-proletarian cannot form any idea that their class, in transitioning from an old to a new age, not only called upon the proletarian to work on means of production that did not belong to them, but was also unable to add to this work a soul content that supported them. People who skirt around life in speech and action in the way described above may say, but the proletarian just wants to be brought into a life situation that matches that of the ruling classes. So, where in all this does the question of soul content play any role? Sure, the proletarian themselves may claim, I ask nothing of the other classes in regard to my soul. I want them to stop exploiting me. I want the class differences that now exist to end. However, such talk does not capture the essence of the social question. It reveals nothing of the true form of this question, because such a consciousness within the souls of the working population, had they inherited a genuine spiritual content from the ruling classes, would raise social demands in a completely different way than the modern proletarian does, who can only see an ideology in the cultural life it received. This proletariat is convinced of the ideological character of cultural life, but this conviction makes it increasingly unhappy. And the effects of this misfortune of soul, which the proletariat does not consciously know and yet suffers intensively, far outweigh, in terms of the significance of the effects for the social situation of the present, everything that is merely a demand, also legitimate in its own way for improvement in their external life situation.
Okay, thank you,
Mhm.
Linda. I think the main idea here, and that as we're reaching the end of our time, is to just look at this notion of an ideology that science has become not really a soul-bearing content, but more like an ideology, a way of thinking, a series of concepts. And this is because it's hollow, because it kind of rings hollow for people. This kind of materialist science is ultimately dissatisfactory. And but the way that it's portrayed is that it seems to be a hope and faith, and that if only the working class were to take over the means of production and socialize and get their fair share of the profits and surpluses, that would be the solution. But, we look back now, Steiner was writing this in 1919, but we look back now on what happened in Russia, what happened in China, and various other countries when the means of production were socialized. this didn't necessarily lead to the great happiness that was anticipated, you know. And I think what Steiner's words here bear out in fact, in history, is that this is not the solution. Obviously having more material wealth is not a bad thing. It's just that it is not going to lead to our satisfaction. This is not what is ultimately the cause of our satisfaction, and it is ultimately not what is going to be the solution either. And so he's basically saying we haven't really understood the depths of the situation. The so-called practical people haven't really grasped what the real problem is. And the real problem is actually something cultural, not economic. It's something that lives in our thinking, something that is not satisfying about our understanding, our worldview, our way of understanding ourselves in the world. And this is actually where we need to begin. Does that make any sense, or is it
Makes
crazy?
it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I mean, it we understand just in the individual, that if we're looking at a particular life situation in a way that is unhelpful to us, that we can actually shift our consciousness, or our we can shift that paradigm, or the way that we look at ourselves, at the world, and the narrative that we have. If we can do that, then it can change our outlook, it can change our life circumstances for the better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
it mhm,
and I was going to say it this is even true today. I think there are still people that believe if I had another car and a bigger house and more
mhm,
rooms, then I'd be happy. And then there are so many people that have these things and they're still not happy. And
mhm,
so the question is just what is it exactly that is causing this dissatisfaction, and
mhm,
what is actually the going to help us?
mhm.
Is it having a bigger house? Is that really going to do it?
Right, right.
No,
You know,
I think Steiner is putting his finger on something that's deeper
mhm,
than this.
yeah. And I think that the call to actually feel and sense and know that there is something deeper and more fundamental underlying all of this surface stuff. I can accumulate all the stuff in the world and sort of, I'm not going to be happy. So what does that mean, right? I could be locked in my own um, cage, basically, of stuff.
Yeah.
And, so what is it? It's a very good question. And I mean, I'm hearing the uh, sort of the finger pointing towards the cultural life. So I can't wait to see what that is and how that is a better place to sort of focus.
Yeah, I don't want to give away the end of the story. The butler did it, but I will say that Steiner does see the cultural life as being a starting point
Mhm.
for for social healing.
Mm,
Okay.
thank
So
you.
I think that's all the time we have for this podcast, and so we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like and subscribe.